This is the story of Allegheny Airlines Flight 853. Most of us aren't familiar with Allegheny Airlines, and maybe this is the first time you're hearing about them. So here's a quick history lesson. Allegheny Airlines started out as a mail carrier in the United States in the late 1940s, and at that time they were called All American Airways. They quickly switched to passenger flights in the early 1950s, and that's when they picked up the moniker Allegheny Airlines. It was a regional airline, and it would later become USair, which would eventually be merged with American Airlines. On the 9th of September 1969, an Allegheny Airlines DC-9 was to fly from Boston Logan Airport to St. Louis International Airport, with 3 stopovers in between at Friendship International Airport, the Greater Cincinnati International Airport, and Indianapolis International Airport. The plane departed Boston at 12 p.m. EDT, with 78 passengers and 4 crew members on board. The plane made it to Cincinnati with no issues and departed Cincinnati at 3:15 p.m. EDT. The plane was under IFR, or instrument flight rules, which meant that the pilots were flying by their instruments. Under VFR, or visual flight rules, you could use visual cues to navigate. For example, you could use a highway to help you get where you needed to go. At 3:22 p.m., the Indianapolis ARTCC, or the Air Route Traffic Control Center controller, radioed the plane. Allegheny 853 is in radar contact, cross Shelbyville VOR, and maintain 6,000, and your position now 32 miles southeast of Shelbyville. Flight 853 started its descent from 10,000 feet now that it had been cleared down to 6,000 feet. The controller contacted the plane, and the controller told the crew to expect a visual approach onto runway 31 left at Indianapolis International Airport. The controller also cleared the plane down to 2,500 feet. The crew acknowledged and now began their slow descent from 6,000 feet to 2,500 feet. The crew radios 853 cleared down to 2,500 and report reaching. As the DC-9 streaked towards Indianapolis, a very different story was unfolding miles away. A Piper PA-28 was being prepped for takeoff at Brookside Airpark. Its pilot, a student pilot that was going to take the plane out for a cross-country solo flight. The student pilot had intended to fly the plane from Brookside Airpark to the Purdue University Airport, but bad weather meant that the pilot had to make a few changes. The pilot decided to fly to Bacala Air Force Base, about 40 miles south of Brookside. The airpark manager inspected the plane and filed the pilot's VFR plan. At 3:21 p.m., as the DC-9 was about to start its descent from 10,000 feet, the student pilot was airborne and heading in a southeasterly direction. Soon after this, the ARTCC controller handed Flight 853 off to the approach controller. The plane at this time was 10 miles southeast of the Shelbyville VOR and on the V97 airway. Let's take a look at the map to try and figure out where they were. Now I know that this map looks a little bit complex, but it'll make sense, and if that doesn't, that's fine. I'll have a simpler map later on in the video. On the right, we have Cincinnati Airport, and on the left, we have the Indianapolis International Airport. The waypoint in between them is the Shelbyville VOR. Let's zoom in on the Shelbyville VOR. Here you can clearly see the V97 airway that they were flying along. So at this point, they were on a heading of about 300 degrees at 10 miles from the VOR. That puts them about here. As Flight 853 got to within 5 miles of the VOR, they were asked to make a left turn. This would set them up perfectly for a visual approach onto runway 31. The controller at this point turned his attention away from Allegheny Flight 853 to tend to other planes in the area. He was talking to Allegheny Airlines Flight 820, which was coming in from the southwest. As he looked back to his radar scope, he could not find Flight 853 anywhere. As he frantically searched for the missing plane on his radar scope, witnesses on the ground had seen exactly what happened. On that day, they saw 2 planes. One was a passenger jet flying westward, and the other a small private plane that was flying on a southeasterly heading. They watched as the planes closed in on each other, and they merged. They expected both planes to keep flying, but to their shock, the Piper flew right into the T-tail of the DC-9. Both planes started dropping from the sky. They watched as both planes plummeted. The DC-9 rolled over and was flying inverted as it crashed into a soybean farm. All on board both planes had died. No one on the ground was injured. Now the investigators had to figure out how two planes collided over the skies of Indianapolis. Right out the bat, they found an issue. The terminal area that the DC-9 was flying into was complex. It had an intermingling of two types of airplanes, high-speed planes like the DC-9 and low-speed airplanes like the Piper. In most mid-air collisions, there's one plane that's supposed to be there and one plane that's imposing on that airspace. So the investigators looked at the final moments of each plane to see who was in the wrong. During the last 50 seconds of flight, the DC-9 was descending at 2,400 feet per minute to its assigned altitude of 2,500 feet. The plane probably started its descent while it was still in the clouds. The DC-9 was right on the arrival path for all incoming traffic from the southeast, and it was descending as it was supposed to. They talked to the instructor of the student pilot, and he had been warned about traffic in the area, and the student pilot was warned to keep his eyes peeled for other aircraft in the area. Based on the wreckage of the Piper, it seems that the student did not deviate from his filed VFR flight plan. The DC-9 was an IFR, and they were in the clouds descending, so it stands to reason that they could not see the Piper till it was too late, and due to the cloud cover, the Piper could not see the DC-9. It looks as if the complexity of the terminal area was partly to blame. The intermingling of high-speed and low-speed traffic definitely contributed to the crash, but it does not explain the crash. Pilots are taught to see and avoid, that is to look out of their cockpits, check for conflicting traffic, and to then take evasive action. But that day there were two layers of clouds. The lower deck extended to about 4,000 feet. This meant for a portion of its descent, the DC-9 was blinded by clouds. The investigators calculated that the DC-9 would have only had about 14 seconds to see the Piper before impact. So the question now becomes, was 14 seconds enough for them to see and avoid each other? The minimum time needed to respond to a collision varies, and since this was the 1960s, most of the studies at that time were focused on older, slower planes, and not towards jets. Some studies said that in complex situations, you'd need about a full minute to avoid a collision. Other studies put that number closer to about 25 to 50 seconds. But the investigators came to the conclusion that pilots needed at least 15 seconds of warning. Any less than that, and their chances of avoiding a collision were slim. When they listened to the CVR, they found that both pilots were busy with the descent. Allegheny Airlines had this policy that the pilot not flying call out the altitude when they were 1,000 feet above the altitude that they were cleared to. This meant that as the plane hit 3,500 feet, the first officer would be looking down at the altimeter to make that call out. The CVR confirmed that the co-pilot indeed did make that call out 2 seconds before impact. The captain could not see the Piper at this point in time from where he was sitting on the left side. Another thing that they realized was that see and avoid could not be relied upon anymore to keep our aviators safe. Sure, it worked well in the past, but the jet age was here, and these planes flew faster than ever before. Moreover, collisions happened when one plane was changing altitude. With faster speeds, the rate at which planes descended also grew to about 3,000 feet per minute. This further reduced the time to react. To quote the report, "It is the board's conclusion that the see and be seen concept of collision avoidance, which has been demonstrably deficient in the past, is now totally unacceptable in providing separation between aircraft during descents into terminal areas where high and low speed traffic is intermixed under VFR and IFR control." End quote. That's just a polite way of saying, look, our system barely worked in the past, and now it just does not work in this new age of jets. But wait, wasn't the crew in touch with ATC who had radar screens? Why didn't they just warn the crew about the Piper? The controller was under a light workload, and the controller did make sure that Flight 853 was safe. But as it turned out, the radar system at Indianapolis was being operated at low power to reduce atmospheric clutter. This meant that the small Piper was never picked up on radar. The controller had no idea that the plane was even there. Had the controller known about the Piper, he or she could have warned the crew, and that would have given the crew enough time to avert the disaster. There was another radar station, but that was scanning the area ahead of Flight 853. The radar scope might have shown the Piper for about 5 minutes, but at that time the controller was busy and did not look down at the radar scope. This accident proved the need for transponders on all planes, and today we have that. Most major airports today are surrounded by controlled airspaces, which does a much better job of separating IFR and VFR traffic. This accident showed that the systems at the time were flawed and that changes needed to be made. Today when you fly, you have so many layers of technology watching over you. You have much better radar tech that can warn controllers of possible conflicts. You have systems like TCAS, which help pilots in avoiding collisions. These changes were brought about in response to accidents like that of Allegheny Airlines Flight 853. Had we not learned from our mistakes, a lot more accidents would have taken a lot more lives. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. A big thank you to Ron Farrell for letting me use his amazing footage on my videos. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. Thank you. I'll catch you guys next time. Stay safe. Wash your hands.